You began to plant the seed in people's minds. But I think in the process, you did create a media image of me that's far beyond, the reality of me.
And this craving, this awful, raging, eating feeling inside. I could feel it consuming my insides. It was overwhelming me.
Hello again and welcome to Serial Killing, a podcast. My name is Elissa Kerrill and I am the researcher, the writer, producer, editor, so on and so forth, all the things. And this podcast is where I cover all things true crime, not just serial killers, because as long as I've been at this, as many years as I've been at this, I just had to expand. And it's okay. It's perfectly fine. So if you are into entire stories of these dangerous people, mostly including and focusing on the childhood experiences and possible genetically inherited issues, the nature versus nurture debate, well, then you have come to the right place, my friends, because that's what I do here. I mean, if you are anything like me, then you do want to know the hows and the whys of people that commit crime, right? So if you are into murder and mayhem with some stories of animal uprising and just general shenanigans, check out my second podcast, Serial Killing, Murder in the News. It's kind of slapstick. We don't take things seriously over there, but it's entertaining nonetheless, or so those listeners tell me. So with all of that out of the way, this podcast had been requested of me a few times over the years, but a close friend sort of reminded me that I needed to cover it, so of course I said I would, and here we are. The podcast is going to be just a bit different than my usual content because, it's still unsolved. So I've decided to approach this as if, picture this in your mind, okay? This is the scenario. I'm setting the scene. Approach this as if I have called your office, clearly from across the country, hurriedly, as I'm trying to catch a flight to meet with you about a brand new case that I need your help with. I think we might have some fun putting together a profile of the murderer, and as always, I love to hear your thoughts and your theories about anything that I cover. Love the community, and I love that we communicate. So let's jump right in. So today's podcast will be on the Lake Bodom murders. Now, right off the bat, folks, I need to say that even though I did look up the pronunciations of the Finnish names and places, my mouth is just not capable of forming those words with any level of confidence or accuracy. So I apologize in advance, and especially to my Finnish listeners for that. Please find it in your hearts to forgive me. I will do my best. So this case was labeled as Finland's biggest mystery. So here is what happened. This is how it started. On Sunday, June 5th, 1960, started like any other day. In southern Finland, late spring was in full swing. The days were warm enough to shed winter coats and long sleeves, and people were coming outside to get some much-needed vitamin D from the sun. They're northern Europe, right? The evenings were still cool enough to enjoy a campfire, and this day was no different. People were visiting Finland's famous Lake Bodom, a small lake just under about 2 miles long that is west of the capital city, Helsinki. Early that June Sunday morning, a few older boys were at the lake. They were bird watching and generally enjoying a walk. It was just before 6 a.m., and as they got to the southern shore of the lake, a spot called the Eastern Peninsula, they noticed what they thought was a flattened tent or a collapsed tent with a person laying on top of it. Moments later, they stated they witnessed a blonde man walking away into the trees. There were 2 motorcycles propped near the tent, and they would later say that they wanted to get a look at the bikes but decided not to disturb the sleeping camper. They detected some slight movements from the camper's body that was laying on top of the collapsed tent. They figured, he's probably had too much to drink. They didn't think too much of it, wanting to really kind of mind their own business, and they went on their way. So around that same time, a 14-year-old teen boy who had been fishing just west of the campsite for a bit noticed movement in the distance, and, he looked up just in time to see what he described as a blonde man of average height, about 80 meters or 262-ish feet away, walking with purpose, you could say, south from the campsite, and the teen estimated the time to be around 6 a.m. He said he didn't see anything or hear anything at all before seeing the man, and that the man had been wearing a light-colored shirt and dark pants. So later in the morning, a group of teenagers had decided to go for a swim, and they were able to see a collapsed tent in the distance and thought it odd, but other than noteworthy, didn't think anything about it. Another source stated that a woman by the name of Ruth Cawley was said to have seen the collapsed tent from a bit of a distance and alerted her husband to it, but we have to assume that they also went about their business, because you have to understand that people that see these things, you only see that stuff in news. Back then it would be, the newspapers and magazines. You would read about these things in novels and books and that sort of thing. But to the average person, the last thing that they're going to think that is a dead body on top of a tent, or the bird watchers thinking that is a writhing in pain, nearly dead body on top of a tent. Their brain's just not going to automatically go there because they're not like us. They're normal. But I digress. So then at around 10 a.m., some others had noticed the tent, but just weren't close enough to make anything of import out of it, aside from thinking the campers had gotten drunk and gotten a fight. And then at just after 11 a.m. that Sunday morning, a man stumbled upon the collapsed tent and the gruesome scene that was also on display. Sources are apparently divided on the man's name as to who it was that found the scene. But in the grand scheme of this story, his actual name doesn't really matter. I mean, I'm glad he found them, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that there was a man that came upon the campsite and saw that there were deceased teenagers there. So he ran to a construction site that wasn't too terribly far away. He used their phone. He called the police. So let's talk about the crime scene, and then we will get into the basic bios of the victims and whatnot, okay? So the local police saw that it was such a horrific scene, they called a special criminal police team to come work the scene. There were 4 teenagers lying down, all in very close proximity to each other. 2 bodies were still completely contained within the collapsed walls of the tent, so covered by the walls and the top of the tent they were covered. 1 body was almost all the way out, and then the 4th body lay on top of the tent on the wholly outside of it. Seppo was an 18-year-old male who they found over into the very far side fold of the tent, laying face up with his legs out straight, still covered with the wall of the tent, like kind of cocooned. Now they could tell his hands were on his chest as if he'd been sleeping. Once exposed, once they got the tent off of him, they noted that he had been wearing blue jeans that were unbuttoned and a blue shirt with a collar. According to the autopsy report, Seppo had sustained multiple blunt force trauma blows to his head and jaw with a blunt object, resulting in 4 fractures on the left side. He had also been stabbed multiple times through the tent fabric, so from the outside of the tent, in his neck and throat area, and a final stab wound to his chest that would have had his lungs drowning in blood so fast. So next to Seppo in the tent was his girlfriend, 15-year-old Tuliki. Now she had been face down on the floor of the tent and mostly under a blanket, but was just kind of barely on top of, or at least overlapping, touching Seppo. She was fully clothed with no signs of sexual assault or previous activity. Tuliki had also sustained multiple blunt force trauma to her head, multiple blows to her head. The autopsy report stated her skull had been fractured in multiple places. One Reddit source said Tuliki had been murdered outside of the tent, so I wanted to mention that, but I do not think that is accurate. I just Just going to mention it just in case. What is true is that a towel had been placed over her head, and she had not died immediately. It is thought that she lived for a further 3 to 4 hours before she finally passed. Dear God. Next to Tuliki was her best friend, also 15-year-old Emily. Only she had been turned like a bit where her legs were up against Tuliki. Emily had suffered the same fate as her friends, right? Several heavy blows with a blunt object that fractured her skull, namely her forehead, jaw, and down that whole side of her face. We are talking multiple fractures. The injuries would have caused her to die nearly instantly. Then the perpetrator pulled her partially out from under the tent walls, almost completely. Emily then, after she was already dead, okay, she was already deceased, sustained a further 15 stab wounds to her neck and shoulders. Her pants and underwear had been entirely removed, save just the very bottom of one of the legs. Her sweater had been pulled all the way up to her shoulders, exposing her bra and a lot of bare skin. There was a pillowcase somewhat nearby that had later tested positive for semen inside of it, and that did not match Seppo or our very last victim. All sources stated that Emily was believed to be the main target of the murderer. The other victims had a lot less damage, I guess you could say. So Nils was the final victim and the only one that was found 100% outside of the tent. He was the one on top of it. Nils had also suffered blunt force trauma to the head. He had a fractured left jaw as well as to his temporal bone. The upper jaw and cheekbone had smaller fractures, but fractured nonetheless. The entire left side of his face was badly swollen, and his eye was swollen completely shut. He had sustained knife slashes to his face, stabs to his face, and one of those was deep enough and big enough to expose his teeth from within, and the back of his left forearm was also cut pretty bad. He was wearing a gray sweater, dark jeans, and clean socks because his shoes were missing. Except Nils was still alive, though again very badly injured and unconscious. There were flies already buzzing around and landing on his blood-covered face, literal cerebral spinal fluid dripping out of his nose. Just soak that in for a minute. His own brain juices were leaking out of his nose. The attacker either pulled Nils out after he had bludgeoned him due to his blood being inside the tent like the others. His blood was found inside, just like his friends. Or Nils had crawled out before he lost consciousness. He was immediately taken to the hospital, and we'll get back to him in a minute, but we need to finish the crime scene, okay? So we have a collapsed tent, and as investigators began to really look, they noticed that the rope or the cord that the tents used to tie up Stay Steady had been purposefully and deliberately cut, and that is what had made the tent fall into itself. Whoever did that would then know where each victim had been positioned, and they used something like a crowbar or something other heavy, blunt object and went to town, beating each of them in the head repeatedly. The perpetrator had then stabbed the victims, some of them through the tent fabric. The tent itself was small enough that 4 people sleeping in it would have been tight quarters. The fabric of the tent, of course, had holes stabbed and slashed into it and had absorbed a lot of blood from the wounds of the victims that it had once sheltered. There were missing items from the victims, including, of course, Nils's shoes that they found nearly a third of a mile away from the bodies. Those shoes had the victim's blood inside of them and had been hidden under a rock, I believe. So this explains Nils being just in his clean socks. The keys to both motorcycles that the bird watchers had seen were missing. Both boys' wallets were also missing. Some clothing from the victims and other small items like the boys' watches. Soda cans were empty, but one still had a mix of soda and liquor in it. and also a fingerprint that did not match the 4 victims. The killer had left both motorcycles there. None of the missing items have ever been found that I could find. The crime scene was also not well protected or taped off by the police or the special investigative team or any other authorities who arrived on scene. So the crime scene was super compromised. They took every teeny piece of anything to evaluate as evidence, though, but they came up dry. The 2 murder weapons were also never found. And that's your crime scene. Those are the most important pieces of the crime scene. So who were these kids? A brief introduction, if I may. So we will start with the first victim we talked about, Seppo. He and Nils had been inseparable best friends since they were 12 years old. Both had been 18 at the time of the attack. Seppo appeared to have more fair hair compared to his BFF Nils, whose hair was much darker. Seppo had somewhat recently graduated high school and was working as an electrician. And the pictures of him circling the internet of when he was much younger than he was actually when he died. Seppo's girlfriend was Tuliki. Well, that's the name she went by. I couldn't. Please don't ask. Again, she had been 15 years old. She was pretty with dark hair. I'm not sure how long she and Seppo had been a couple, but Tuliki was also friends with Ermeli outside of her relationship with Seppo. So it's like besties who dated another set of besties. I mean, you love to hear it, right? So Ermeli was a pretty young lady with more fair hair than her friend and was the girlfriend of the lone survivor, Nils. Nils had followed the same path as Seppo after high school graduation. He went to work as an electrician for the same company as Seppo. So the couples decided they wanted to go camping together. When the girls asked if they could go, their respective parents, of course their parents were reluctant, as any good parents would be. And though they were nearly 16, times were a bit different then, and they would have been at least at an acceptable marrying age, if you can believe that. But for whatever reason, or whatever those girls told their parents, they finally got permission to go. Of course, the boys' parents weren't concerned about their strong, strapping sons, and off the couples went, the girls riding behind the boys on their respective motorcycles to Lake Bodom. A condom had been purchased, along with some liquor, snacks. The tent Seppo had borrowed from their work. They brought fishing gear, and by 5 p.m. that Saturday, they had found their camping spot, and they, later began to set up their camp. So the couples drove back down the road just a bit to a kiosk. That's what the source material labels it, but I guess some kind of very small shop kind of thing. And they bought some chewing gum and soda to mix with the alcohol. By 7 p.m. that evening, the couples were back at camp, hanging out, watching as swimmers in the lake began to get out and leave the lake. Then the girls swam. Then they got out, and the boys mixed the soda with the liquor they had, but Nils, the one survivor, would later say that they didn't drink much of it because it tasted terrible. Tuliki and Ermeli didn't drink any at all. So after the couples had a little makeout sesh, at around 10:30 that night, they all squeezed into the small tent and went to sleep. Apparently, the boys woke up just before 3 a.m. and decided to do some fishing. But you must remember that in June in southern Finland, or so my research showed me, it doesn't really get dark there at night at all. The website says that I looked up, they experience, quote, nearly around-the-clock daylight. Not that night fishing isn't great, because it is. I'm just painting the picture for your mind. But when they got back from that, the girls had awakened, and Tuliki made a note in a songbook that she had or something of the boys having gone and come back. She wrote it down, and they all went back to sleep again. So the time of the murders is said to have been between 4 and 6 a.m. Sunday morning. It obviously had to have been after the boys finished their fishing and went back to the tent and back to sleep. And that's pretty much all of the backstory and forensics you need. There's a lot of speculation and nonsense out there, quite frankly. And I've just saved you from a whole lot of it. This is the core concrete stuff. So we have some witnesses that saw a man, right, with light-colored hair and a light-colored top and dark pants quickly leaving the scene, as in swiftly. They saw him from different vantage points. They indicated this man had most definitely been at the crime scene or near enough to have seen the murdered teens. It wasn't much to go on, though, okay? And this crime caught the national attention immediately, and the Finnish government wanted all suspects apprehended as fast as humanly possible. And we will get into the suspects momentarily. It was 4 days after the brutal attack when Nils woke up in the hospital and found out about his injuries and his friends. Multiple skull and jaw fractures, stab wounds, and one to his face enough that you could again see his teeth through the hole. And he was questioned once he was cleared to be, and he told the authorities all that we've discussed about what happened and what the teens had been up to, everything up until they all went back to sleep for the final time. But he could not remember the attack at all. He went to sleep with his friends and he woke up in the hospital. They even asked one Dr. Stenbeck, who was then a well-known professor of psychiatry at the University of Helsinki, if he would come and try to put Nils under hypnosis to see if he could remember anything further. Now, under 3 different hypnosis sessions, the first 2 not producing any new information, but during the 3rd, Nils said that he could remember hearing the girls scream out and the tent falling down on them. He said he could see blood all over Emily's head. That was the one that was his girlfriend. Then Nils finally said he could see a man who was around 30 years old with longer, light-colored hair. He further described the man's face as being kind of round with some acne. He said the man had been wearing a darker sweater and dark pants, so his description does nearly match the witnesses, save the dark sweater. But if we want to speculate on this little part, like pause for just half a second and think about it, if Nils's recollection is true, well, the murderer could have purposefully had a dark sweater on and then took it off after the crime. I mean, it's plausible, who knows? But that is what Nils said. Take that info however you will. The authorities took Nils to the lake where the tent had been to see if anything else might jog his memory, but nothing significant came from his visit. It's as if he had suffered a traumatic brain injury and had legit memory loss or something. I don't understand how they didn't understand that. So there were quite a few people pulled in for questioning, and all were proven to not be the killer. Airtight alibis, no question as to their innocence. So, who did that leave? Well, let me tell you about our main suspects. A man by the name of Penty, who had later been convicted of violent crimes in the late 60s, confessed to the murders when he was just 14 years old and already in prison. Imagine. He said that when he was around that age, he had actually lived near the site of the murders. The authorities brought him in for questioning, but he was ultimately declared a psychopath whose confession could not hold weight. In an interesting chain of events, he hanged himself in 1969 on the actual anniversary of the murders. But I'm not thinking that he's the one that did it. So our next suspect is a man whose name is going to haunt me after this because I know you guys are never going to let me hear the end of it. His name is Hans Assmann. So Hans had been a former German Nazi soldier, allegedly, I don't know if I believe that, working in the concentration camp Auschwitz, which I also don't think I believe, and also had boasted that he had worked either for or with the Russian KGB as a spy when he deflected from Germany. It was said that Hans walked into a hospital in Helsinki wearing red-stained clothing. It was later the same day of the murders. His fingernails had been filled with dirt underneath. The hospital staff said he was acting strangely, nervous, and kind of aggressive. He even feigned being unconscious, sources said. He faked it. Hans also had longer blonde hair, and then he promptly cut it after the description of the fleeing man was released by the news. He did look quite a bit like the sketches described by the witnesses. But the police didn't pursue him any further. The doctors who saw him at the hospital told the police the red stains were blood, and yet the clothes were not taken in for analysis. The clothing he had been wearing? Well, not surprising, a light-colored shirt and dark pants. He lived only a few miles from the lake, but the police said he had a solid alibi. Kind of smarmy, but an alibi. His wife had been out of town, so he went to his lover's house. And there were other people at the house as well, and these are people that would otherwise not stick up for him. So the police said his alibi was airtight. I think it's squeaking a little. The next suspect is a man by the name of Carl Gilstrom. Carl is what you might call a dick. He was a cantankerous man, described as spiteful, and owned one of those kiosks that the 4 teenagers visited. And now, as kind of a sidebar, I went back through all of my notes because I could have sworn that I read that it was his specific kiosk, Carl the Dick's kiosk, that the teens had visited, but I couldn't find that. So I'm about 99% sure, but not 100. But regardless, Carl hated campers and was known to cut the tent ties so that the tents would fall in on the campers. Ooh. He threw rocks at passing children. He was very aggressive and, according to the locals, violent. There were a small few that would later say that he had been the one that they'd seen leaving the crime scene, but they had been far too scared to point at him and say, he's the one that killed them. Just days after the murders, our man Carl decided he wanted to fill a well in his courtyard on his property. A water well. The police were alerted, and they paid him a visit and decided there was no evidence or reason to even dig it up. Carl even got drunk one night, guys, after the murders and allegedly confessed to his neighbor that he had killed those kids. Of course, Carl denied ever saying that, and the police also considered him, quote, disturbed. His wife told the police that he had been home all night long with her, that she hadn't been able to sleep that night, so she knew that he was home. Now, unfortunately, Carl was dead 9 years later. He drowned himself in Lake Bodom. It is heavily believed he purposefully drowned himself. Why? I don't even think he left a note. But then his wife confessed later that he told her to lie for him because if she ratted him out, he would kill her. Take it for what you will. And then we have one final notable suspect, and that is Nils Gustafsson himself, the lone survivor. His shoes had blood droplets of all of his friends' blood on them and in them, but not his. And they had been hidden a short-ish distance away, a third of a mile. They came up with the theory that Nils had gotten drunk and belligerent, and the other tent occupants had had enough of him. They ordered him out of the tent. He and Seppo, apparently they thought they got into a physical fight, right, where Seppo broke Nils's jaw, and that had prompted him to kill his friends. And then it became a crime of passion because Ermely wouldn't put out, as they said back in those days. And yet another was that Nils had killed his friends for whichever reason you want to choose, then took his shoes off, walked a third of a mile away, hid his shoes under a rock, which is why his blood was not in the shoes, and had the presence of mind after killing his friends to make sure that his socks and feet did not get dirty for the third of a mile walk back, right? And then he injured himself viciously, laid down, and pretended to be unconscious. And he would have had to have pretended for hours while his own brain juices were leaking out of his nose. Okay, I just wanted to make sure we were clear on that. So I took a nosedive, right? I followed the White Rabbit down into Reddit and read what the locals in Finland believed as to who the murderer was. I was surprised at how divided the camps still are in Finland to this day, and this happened in 1960. Most believe it was Carl, the kiosk man, Carl the Dick. Others truly believe it was the former Nazi and alleged KGB spy, Hans. But there are a small few that still believe Nils was the murderer. So let me give you a few logical reasons that I thought of as to the reason why he's not the murderer. This is what I believe, my opinion. Where would he have stashed the motorcycle keys, the watches, their IDs, and so on that they never found? If he was the murderer and took his shoes off after murdering his best friend, right, that they're inseparable, and his brand new girlfriend to quickly hide them under a rock a third of a mile away, okay, how far exactly did they think he went to stash the other items? Items as big as articles of clothing even. How far could he have possibly traveled to hide them, knowing someone could walk up on that scene at any moment? And then, of course, with brain fluid leaking out of his nose, if his friend had fractured his skull and his jaw. Okay? Seems to be a little far-fetched for me. This is just my opinion. Now, Nils's blood was also found inside the tent, in the area he said he had been laying, meaning he had been beaten while still in the tent to some degree. And yet Ermely had been mostly pulled out of the tent. So you mean after he was bludgeoned in the head so severely that he suffered several fractures to the entire left side of his skull, and then had the strength and presence of mind to stab himself repeatedly, including through his cheek, exposing his own teeth, right? Are you with me? And then have the precise coordination to pull Ermely out of the tent and pull her pants nearly completely off, pull her sweater way up, just humiliating her. Keep in mind, brain juices leaking out of his nose. Did he then lay down, his head bleeding pretty badly, to the point that it had begun to really attract a lot of flies that were landing on his face for hours, and yet he was able to lay still and endure all that pain? No. For me, I don't believe it. And the last argument I wanted to make was whether or not Nils was left or right-handed. So you know his injuries were to the left side of his head and jaw. Pictures of him show he wore a watch on his left wrist, which generally means the person is right-handed, but that's not always the case. If he were right-handed, though, imagine how difficult it would be to bash your own head in, fracturing bones with any power with your right hand to the left side of your head. I mean, it's not impossible, but it's highly, highly unlikely. I dug, but I couldn't find which hand was his dominant one. But regardless, I just don't see him being the murderer. Nils had nothing to gain from that. He had a good job. He was making his own money. Sebo was his very best friend and had been for years. Chosen brothers. They worked together. Their girlfriends were best friends. There were no reports of any issues that were of any note in Nils's childhood. No one hated him. He had no enemies that I could find. He was happy. So fast forward from 1960, but then back in 2005, they arrested him again, stating there was new forensic evidence and they had this big trial. He was an elderly man at this point. He was like a retired bus driver. Nils's charges were entirely and completely dismissed by the court. There just was no evidence. Oh, and remember, the semen they found in that pillowcase did not belong to either boy, not Seppo, not Nils. And it has been widely agreed that the killer took Nils's shoes off his feet and put them on himself. But for what reason? They didn't have any solid theories for that. And then so we have the murderer. Not only did he beat them, literally bashed their skulls in, but he also then stabbed them repeatedly after he had already caused all of that skull and jaw fractures and brain swelling and whatnot. He then went on to stab them. How angry do you have to be to unleash that kind of rage? What is going on that you are so offended mentally or physically by the camper's presence or whatnot for you to just absolutely wide open massacre 4 innocent teenagers just trying to have a good time in their teens? Was it just someone waiting to be able to attack someone and they just chose a campsite because that's the one they saw? Was it random? Was it someone that had seen them? Was it Mr. Kiosk Man who was pissed off because they were there? Or did the murderer know them? Did he know that they were going to go there? I really don't know. So, with the evidence presented to you and the most popular suspects described, who do you think murdered these teens and left Nils in a full coma for days? Leave me your theories or ideas in the comments, or let's talk about it in the Facebook podcast group. Any and all contact information is linked down below, but I really would love to have some dialogue about this. What are your theories? And if you are from Finland in particular and familiar with the case, please let us know what the locals are still saying. Give us your thoughts and opinions. And as always, guys, thank you so much for listening, because I know you could be listening to anyone else, but you just keep choosing me, and I really appreciate that. I really, really do. Have a good day, guys. Bye.
Anybody who killed more than 2 or 3 people was a mass murderer, and whether it was all at one place or over an extended period of time. And then in the early 80s, they came up with this differentiation called serial killing.